Hi, I'm Eric, and I'm a social studies educator, historian, and host of this, the Everything is a Primary Source podcast. I'm also an avid collector of popular culture artifacts. I love what I find at thrift store outlets, garage sale leftovers, and what I spot just making my way around the built world. I enjoy sorting through boxes of free books and magazines, not to mention online collections like Internet Archive, and of course the Library of Congress. But you don't need to spend your time digging through bins or following online rabbit holes to get a look into the past. The movies and TV we watch, the books we read, and the games we play are all documents of the past. So is fashion, food, music, toys, even the roads we travel on and the places we live and work in. Everything is a primary source. This podcast is the result of exhibiting these kinds of artifacts in public, getting passersby to select an item they connect with, and then chatting with me to see what it says about the time, place, and people who made it. The conversation you are about to hear, therefore, is your history, my history, our history, through popular culture. Mitch, you are my first catch of the day. You're my first person to talk to here at the Ephemera Fair in Old Greenwich, Connecticut. And what brings you here? Are you a big-time collector of paper items?
Mainly comic books. Mainly comic books and old Mad magazines. You know, it's like how to beat the high cost of living. I used to go to Paper Mania a lot, but they ran into some problems. COVID knocked them down, and now their venue is gone. So I'm checking out other places. Very often, I can get my comic books and my Mad magazines and other stuff that I like cheaper at Paper Mania or sort of like ephemera events than I would at actual comic book conventions.
Do you assume that's just because if you were to go to a comic book convention, everybody there is an expert on what they're selling, and so they therefore are more, the value side of it? Like I said to you just before I hit record, I found that, and I thought it was a reproduction, but I found that at a Goodwill by the pound, and it was just among a bunch of other comics that clearly somebody didn't know the value of it, just kind of chucked it.
Well, like my dad used to say, and my grandfather used to say, what's the value of something? What you're willing to pay for it.
Yeah.
And underground comics are famous for multiple print runs. So I'm holding the Freak Brothers, the collected adventures of the fabulous Furry Freak Brothers, underground comic that was sold mainly through head shops or drug paraphernalia businesses before they became legitimized, and before you had the comic book market. So they had multiple editions, so pricing these books can be difficult at times because the first edition may net you more than a second edition unless the second edition had a very low print run. So it's really confusing at times.
So to somebody who's not necessarily willing to put that much effort into doing the research, they see something like this, and unless they are familiar with the title, there's a good chance it's going to end up in the donation box and be on its way to a clearance center. But to your good fortune, because you came across it and I came across it, and when it comes to this particular title, and I think you hinted at it already a little bit, but who is the intended audience of this particular comic? So you're a comics expert. What was the comic book scene like throughout the 1960s that would have led to something like this?
Well, something you had up to the 50s even, or the 60s, comic books were really made for general market of children. It scared some people because for the first time, like the first 23 issues of Mad magazine, which were in comic book format, it was something children could buy on their own. So if there were subversive ideas, it was going into the hands of children, because children would go to the newsstand with their dime and buy what they want.
Yeah.
The underground comic is an extension. It started in the 60s, where a lot of these people born and raised on comics were now doing their own comic books. And of course, because they were not running it through the usual distribution channels like newsstands, there were no comic book shops in those days. They would do through head shops, and even Robert Crumb is famous for selling some comics in San Francisco and Haight-Ashbury in a baby carriage. So people were doing their own thing. So of course now you were getting into drugs and explicit sex and violence amongst other things. The Freak Brothers was aimed at people who were obviously enjoying the so-called hippie culture, but I think also it was hitting people in their early to late teens and college students. Those are the market for it.
I make this point a lot to people, especially my students, when it comes to other forms of media that, especially in that time period, but I think it's still true today, that print media supports and is connected to other forms of media. So we're talking about Haight-Ashbury. The first thing that comes to mind when people think about that is music, right? They think of the music scene. And, and the hippie culture also had, they may have rejected certain things. Like, I can't think of too many TV shows that were embraced by that culture, but they would turn to other forms of expression, and I think this fits it perfectly. So, in other words, what you're saying is that as the audience was maturing, kind of like the rock and roll audience, as they got older, or maybe in a new generation of rock and rollers, they also wanted something that matched up with their interests, and this would be it.
I would agree with
literature.
it 100%, because you had Superman by DC Comics at the time, or Batman, who played it pretty straight. But when you dealt with the underground comics, for the most part, if you read the majority of them, they really don't make sense. They're kind of stream of conscious things. The Freak Brothers was kind of unique in the sense that the stories were like, I'd say, the great-grandson of the Sunday Funny in a way, because they're 1 or 2 page stories that would actually have a plot, a beginning, a middle, and an end to them, which made the Freak Brothers particularly enjoyable to me. Gilbert Shelton, who did it, also did Wonder Warthog, a kind of Superman parody where there was drugs and violence, but it was funny. It really... they were well crafted. Other ones, like Zap Comics, sometimes you would get a story like by Crumb, and sometimes it would be, as I said before, a stream of conscious thing, very abstract, kind of mirroring what was happening with movies by Andy Warhol and other avant-garde filmmakers at the time.
So would you put this into the avant-garde category as well, or is it a little bit adjacent to that?
I'd say it's kind of like the illegitimate godson of it, because you do have the avant-garde element to it, but you also have the element that it was catering maybe to the more common masses. Like I said, I think it was college students and late high school students who were really indulging in this, but it was part of a movement and a wave. Like you were saying before about, there wasn't a lot of TV programs in the early 70s that really hit on hippie culture, but they did take elements like Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In had those psychedelic paintings, like the little things I remember as a child where they pop out to tell jokes and everything.
Yeah.
On it, and you would also have some TV shows that were bringing the hippies, and usually it was kind of negative, but I do recall that show, The Partridge Family, where they were kind of engaging in that kind of bohemian lifestyle where they're musicians and they were going to clubs and they have the stereotypical thing, and just because it's done poorly doesn't mean it wasn't acknowledged, and they were kind of acknowledging this new culture that was hitting America, a more casual one, one that was less linear than we had seen before.
My most recent podcast that just was released was about Creedence Clearwater Revival's Green River. And, of course, San Francisco and the rock scene there as it was developing. And they always kind of stood out from the rest of that because they tapped so much more into an early rock and roll sound. But the overall culture was still the same. And one thing that should be noted and was brought up in that podcast by my guest said that not only did San Francisco have a huge and growing population of college kids, because we're talking about boomers, right? They're now of age to be going to college, and there's lots of universities and colleges in the Bay Area, but there's also, that was the processing center for the Army for troops returning home from Vietnam. And so a lot of young people looking for outlets, looking for answers, looking for culture, and it's especially appealing if it's culture that they themselves have a hand in making, or at least seem like they could take part in. So like, whether it be rock and roll, which is not, at least at that time, super exclusive, or making your own comics, which again is not, we're not looking at super dynamic illustrations here. This is pretty straightforward, anybody could do it kind of thing.
I'd say that's true. I think it's not only the artistic model, but it's the business model. That when you dealt with Marvel Comics, who did Spider-Man, the Fantastic Four, DC Comics, they're owned by a lot of different corporations. Like I remember one time, DC Comics was owned by the Kenny organization. So I think they did shoes or something, and all these companies were owned by other things within things. While with the Underground Comics, it was more directly owned by the people producing the product. Or sometimes they would form collectives, and sometimes the collectives worked. And sometimes, because you had the dynamics of money and drugs and sex, sometimes they would fall apart. So it's really what you're seeing now, even with, there's another comic scene coming on with these small press publishers and the people doing mini comics and micro comics where they're producing it on their own, very often black and white with color covers and stuff, but they're taking control of the product. Is it successful? I think it's a matter of taste. I mean, to me, there are some underground comics I follow, but I like more linear things like Zippy Pinhead is another one that I follow and stuff, because even though it's a bit abstract, it still follows a storyline, while some of these things don't. Though I may admire the art, I guess for me personally, I like to see a story. It could be a wacky story, it could be a funny story, it could be a story where one thing doesn't necessarily follow the other, but I prefer having a more linear thing go on. But I can understand what was going on at the time. I sometimes question if even the people who were tripping and reading these comics really got them, or was it just like, hey, this is really cool, and maybe they enjoyed it, maybe their state of mind let them enjoy it, but that's for them and it's not necessarily for me, and that's not a bad thing.
No, yeah, maybe it supplemented their lifestyle more than it really entertained them. And I'm wondering if there's an element of, we were talking about independent work here, but if there's an element of the corporatism kind of either keeping things in check or allowing for, so a linear story is a lot more appealing to most people than abstract and weird. People can only tolerate that for so long in large mass. So the ones that emerge from it, I think about. Another San Francisco product from around that same time period is American Zoetrope, which is a bunch of independent filmmakers who were going up against the Hollywood-based, big-time corporate style of movie making. And they were saying, we want to tell our own stories our own way. And eventually, of course, a lot of success from that group, but the most successful, probably at least at that time, was Lucas with Star Wars.
Yes.
And Star Wars immediately becomes a big industry giant thing. I wonder if that was the same things happening to these comics. Was the industry going to kind of choose which of the underground comics would emerge?
Well, I think the underground comics, we look at the underground comics, but maybe it's looking at the tree instead of the forest. I think the thing was there was a massive breakaway coming on in the late 60s, early 70s, where the so-called Young Turk movement of, you had Lucas, you had De Palma coming out there, these new generation of directors, people doing, getting away from the old style acting and doing method acting. Even the Batman TV series in this camper, The Avengers, we're talking about Steed and Peel in England, they were taking the British mod movement. We were breaking away from generations of a slow evolution to a more massive evolution. As the old guard of comic book writers and artists aged, you got this new generation in like Neil Adams and Jim Steranko who were working for Marvel and DC, more so Marvel, and they were just breaking the walls and doing new things, going in a new direction that we had not seen before. I guess, let me summarize it in one word. It was freedom.
I think there was something, and maybe this is a reach or a stretch, but I wonder if it just kind of met the overall feeling of the times as we approach 1976, the bicentennial, this kind of reflection on, you see women activists from that time period dressing up like colonial, in their protests and demonstrations, they look like colonial women. Of course, mainstream fashions, you could, for the entirety of the year in 1876, you could make yourself, little colonial outfits for your kids, and there's, of course, parades and stuff like that. But outside the direct reflections on the bicentennial, I'm curious if these newfound avenues of freedom and expressions of freedom were also maybe that explains a little bit why they were that way.
Yeah, I could see that. I think, though, you have the pioneers, which I'd say was the hippie movement. I mean, you have the patron saint Robert Crumb, Harvey Kurtzman, who did Mad magazine. And at its time, when Mad was a comic, it was very subversive because they dared to criticize Archie Comics, Disney and stuff like that, Howdy Doody. They were taking pot shots at American culture, and I think they were the first wave of people who were really getting out there, especially that Mad magazine, because it said it's all right to criticize society, and people were terrified because, again, children could buy this for a dime and read these rather subversive comic books. I would just like to take a quick change of direction for this and say, we're talking about the value of comics, like you got this at Goodwill by the pound, and I'm so jealous of you for finding it, even though I have like 3 copies of it. One's a special
it's just
European.
that feeling of finding something like that.
Yes, and I envy you for it. It's like I didn't climb Everest, but I'm glad someone did and found it for the cheap. But I just like to talk about one thing. We're at an ephemera show, and the fact is that I was thinking about ephemera really fits because not everything lasts forever, and I'm not talking about the aging of paper. I'm like going to be 60 this year, and I remember when they used to have pulp magazine shows. So you had The Shadow and Doc Savage. These were big, thick paper books that were prose with very sensational covers, and they were made on crappy paper, so they really aged. You don't really see the pulp shows anymore, and I'm wondering, we were talking about comics in the beginning and how I like to come to these shows to see if I can score a good bargain. I'm wondering, will comics one day not be the king of the mountain? Because you have this generation who gets their comic book material by watching superhero movies.
Yeah.
And even some of the independents like Ghost World was made into a rather big film like maybe 10 years ago and stuff, which was rather
20
good.
years ago.
20 years ago, oh my goodness.
Maybe 25 at this point.
I better check my DVD to make sure it's still in good shape then. But my thing about it is, will one day comics, the audience become so small that it'll become a minimalized collectible as the generations go, yeah, big touchstones of America like Action 1 with the first appearance of Superman, Detective 27, the first appearance of Batman, or Amazing Fantasy number 15 with the first appearance of Spider-Man. There'll always be money in those because not only are they big American characters, but they're also big corporate things, corporate mascots almost. But a lot of the people who just buy average, middle-of-the-road comics, are they going to be going away from it and then the price of comics comes crashing? The reason you had to go to you went to Goodwill, I'm not saying had to, but you went there to buy it, is they're overpriced. The comic book price guides that came out was part of the thing that corporatified the price of comics, and then eBay, it can be good if you really hunt, but eBay helped drive the prices up through the roof of these things. So if the average person can't come in there and buy a comic book and come to love it, you're pricing out the next generation of consumers who are going to carry this culture forward. And then what happens? It becomes something that, yes, you always have a niche market for it, but the big market will not be out there. And I think that's eventually going to happen with comics.
I think it's already underway. I know that if you're familiar with the Free Comic Book Day.
Yes.
And where Rochester, New Hampshire, where I live near close by, I've done this exact event at the Jetpack Comics has an annual festival surrounding it. But most comic book shops, it's just come in on that day and get a couple free books and then leave. That, I think, when that was introduced about 20 years ago, was a way to resuscitate or at least keep alive the physical comic book.
Yes.
And get people excited about that. But I think you're absolutely right that the general public still prefers an hour-and-a-half long movie, maybe a series on Netflix. They're not really looking to. You don't have as many people going to the shops and getting their monthly pulls anymore, right? They don't have subscriptions. They're just kind of like, oh, if one happens to be in front of me or if it's free, I'll take it. But I'm not about to go out and follow a storyline by buying an issue every week. That being said, I think that the digital comics have largely failed because the real comic book reader doesn't want to be looking at a screen. They would much rather the physical item in front of them. I think to bring this all home again, and I try my best not to talk about the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles every single time on my podcast. I've already done it probably 24 times, but they're from where I'm from, right? They're from Dover, New Hampshire. And Kevin Eastman has cited that comic that you have, the fabulous Furry Freak Brothers, as one of his inspirations, just underground comics in general. And so one of the reasons for their popularity, even if the kids themselves didn't realize it in the 80s, is because it kept that spirit alive, right? That spirit of rebellion. The size of the comic was different. The original copies of Ninja Turtles was different from the other comics, so it stood out. And it made for that much more of a, all right, that do-it-yourself attitude, that independence, that freedom is still here. It might not be here anymore. The Turtles are very much a corporate entity now, but they started out from the bottom up.
I would have to, I guess, to tap this out, 100% agree with you. I was in the trenches when the Ninja Turtles came out. And as a matter of fact, it started this whole movement.
Or the sewers, I guess.
Yeah, out of the sewers and onto the comic stores. I remember everybody else was trying to imitate it without understanding what made it so successful. Remember, it took a lot of its source material from Marvel Comics, the Daredevil origin, the Radioactive Ooze, martial art movies. It was a good combo. But I think for comics to survive, I think, first off, they have to change their business model. You have to look at other countries where comics are much better productions, like Japan with the manga, or France where the paper and the coloring process is divine. Americans got to get to it. You're paying like $6 and $7 for a flimsy pamphlet. Meanwhile, at the same newsstand, if they exist still, you can buy a big, thick bridal magazine that's 900 pages or something, relatively cheap. We have to start thinking about how to market to the masses. And I'll tell you, I think people have to get there. There are a lot of good sources out there for internet where you can read public domain comics and stuff like that and discover some of the past masters. And you know what? Some of them are free because they're public domain. Nobody's getting hurt. And you can read these stuff out. I'd recommend Jack Cole's Plastic Man, which was as wild as anything you've ever seen in the Freak Brothers, with this guy stretching and changing into things. Really psychedelic stuff that was like the ancestor of this all. And Jack Cole, by the way, is a very fascinating individual. But I would tell people, dive into the past and then go there. And, you know, unfortunately, I'd say don't do anything illegal. Don't illegally download stuff. But there's plenty of great sources out there for legitimate stuff. And discover comics. Maybe those people out there can have their kids read it. And just find sources that are affordable, because it is a great American art form. But I think ultimately it's doomed. I think I'm going to come back with my time machine 50 years from now, and most of these comics will not be worth the paper they're printed on.
It's unfortunate. I really appreciate your insights on this. One thing I'll just add is I think that as much as they would not want to admit it, punks and hippies seem to have a lot in common with each other as far as pulling from the big and making it smaller and more personal and reacting to it and then creating based on that. And so when you were describing all those, you know, you can apply a lot of those same sensibilities that the hippies had that produced something like that to what was emerging in the 80s, 20 years later, with punk being the source and the inspiration of, like, I want to create, and I'm being influenced by the big stuff. I can't avoid that giant movie on the screen. I can't avoid the comic coming out from Marvel Comics. It's going to influence me, but I'm going to create something my own. It's going to be myself. It's going to be with what I'm capable of. Mitch, thank you so much. This has been a great conversation.
It's been a pleasure to talk. Usually my wife gets subjected to this in the car, so it's glad to inflict it on some other individual.
This is kind of where my podcast idea came from, because my wife and I are usually talking about this kind of stuff. So I'm like, hey, let's record it and make it into something. So thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure. Take care.
Popular culture, by definition, connects and unites us, and proves that people of different backgrounds, in fact, have a lot in common with one another. I hope you enjoyed this conversation, at least in part, for that reason. If it connects with you and you'd like to add to it, or any of the podcast episodes, just visit everything-history.com and search for the Everything as a Primary Source project, which can be found in the classroom section of the website. We'd love to hear what you have to say. Be sure to rate and share this podcast wherever you are listening to it now, and follow Everything as a Primary Source on social media, including YouTube and especially Instagram. Thank you for listening to the EPS podcast, where everything is a primary source.